I'm Sarah, 26, and I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like until my own mother wished me out of existence. Standing in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by birthday decorations I'd spent hours arranging, she looked me dead in the eye and said the words that would shatter everything. You know what would be the best birthday gift? If you just disappeared from my life forever. The room went silent except for the sound of my heart breaking. What I didn't know then was that her cruel wish would become her worst nightmare, and the family secret I'd uncover would destroy the perfect image she'd built for decades. But before we dive into how I made her regret those words for the rest of her life, I need to know, what do you think happened next? Did I storm out? Did I confront her? Or did I do something that would make this the ultimate revenge story? Drop your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe because this family drama is about to get absolutely wild. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply giving someone exactly what they asked for. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with that devastating birthday. It starts 26 years earlier, when I was born into what looked like the perfect American family. My mother, Linda, was the epitome of suburban elegance, always perfectly dressed, always hosting the most elaborate parties, always making sure our family looked flawless from the outside. My father, Robert, was a successful lawyer who worked 60-hour weeks to fund Linda's lifestyle and social climbing ambitions. Growing up, I was the dutiful daughter who never questioned why I always felt like an outsider in my own home. While other kids got messy and played freely, I was expected to be a miniature version of my mother, well-behaved, academically excellent, and most importantly, a reflection of her parenting prowess. Every achievement of mine was somehow twisted into evidence of her superior mothering skills. When I graduated valedictorian, she made sure everyone knew it was because of the structure and values she'd instilled in me. When I got into Harvard, she practically threw a parade for herself. But here's what nobody saw behind those picture-perfect family photos: the constant criticism, the emotional distance, and the way she treated me more like a project than a daughter. Nothing I did was ever quite good enough. If I got an A-, she'd ask why it wasn't an A+. If I made the varsity team, she'd wonder why I wasn't captain. If I brought home friends, she'd spend the evening pointing out everything wrong with my social choices after they left. The breaking point started building during my senior year of college. I'd majored in environmental science because I was passionate about climate change and sustainability, two topics that made my mother visibly uncomfortable because they weren't practical or prestigious enough for her standards. She wanted me to go to law school like Dad, or better yet, marry someone wealthy and become a proper society wife. When I announced I was taking a job with a nonprofit organization focused on renewable energy, the disappointment in her voice was unmistakable. "Sarah," she said during one of our weekly phone calls, "you're wasting your potential on these hippie causes. When are you going to grow up and do something meaningful with your life?" The irony wasn't lost on me that she considered saving the planet less meaningful than hosting charity luncheons where wealthy women wrote checks to feel good about themselves. After college, I moved back home temporarily while I saved money for my own place. This was my first mistake, because it gave Linda front row seats to judge every aspect of my adult life. She criticized my clothes, too casual, my friends, not ambitious enough, my boyfriend, lacks direction, and especially my career choice, a dead-end job for idealists. Every morning started with some passive-aggressive comment about my life choices, and every evening ended with a lecture about how I was disappointing her. The tension reached a fever pitch when I started dating Jake, a fellow environmental activist who worked for a local organic farm. Jake was everything my mother despised. He drove an old pickup truck, wore flannel shirts, and had the audacity to be genuinely happy without a six-figure salary. She made it clear that she found him beneath our family standards, often making snide comments about his lack of ambition and poor breeding. The fact that Jake was kind, intelligent, and shared my values meant nothing to her. He didn't fit the image of the son-in-law she'd envisioned, so he was automatically unacceptable. What really sent her over the edge was when Jake and I started talking about moving in together. We'd been dating for 8 months, and it felt natural to take the next step. But when I mentioned our plans during dinner one night, Linda's reaction was swift and brutal. "Absolutely not," she declared, as if I were still 16 instead of 25. "I will not have my daughter living in sin with some farm boy. What will people think?" That's when I realized that my mother's love was entirely conditional on my ability to make her look good. I wasn't her daughter, I was her reputation management system. Every decision I made was filtered through the lens of how it would reflect on her, and since Jake and my career didn't enhance her social standing, they were problems to be eliminated. The final straw came when she started sabotaging my relationship behind my back. I discovered she'd been calling Jake's workplace, complaining about him to anyone who would listen, and even going so far as to spread rumors about his character in our small town. When I confronted her about it, she didn't deny it. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that she was protecting me from making a huge mistake and that someday I'd thank her for saving me from throwing my life away on someone so beneath me. That's when I realized that my mother wasn't just disappointed in my choices, she was actively working to destroy my happiness to preserve her own image. And that realization would set the stage for the most devastating birthday confrontation of my life. The weeks leading up to Linda's 52nd birthday were unlike anything I'd experienced before. She was planning what she called the social event of the season. A lavish garden party with over 100 guests, complete with catered food, live music, and enough flowers to stock a florist shop. But beneath all the party planning, something darker was happening. She was systematically destroying every aspect of my life that didn't align with her vision. It started with Jake's job. Linda had apparently been making anonymous complaints to his supervisor about his unreliable work ethic and unprofessional behavior. When Jake told me he was being written up for issues that made no sense, I immediately suspected my mother's involvement. My suspicions were confirmed when I overheard her on the phone with her friend Margaret, laughing about how easy it was to handle the farm boy problem with a few well-placed phone calls. But she wasn't done with Jake. Next came the social isolation campaign. Linda began hosting elaborate dinner parties and social gatherings, making sure to invite all the right people from our town's social circle. She would specifically mention to these guests that I was going through a rebellious phase and dating someone completely inappropriate. The gossip mill in our small town is vicious, and within weeks, Jake and I were being treated like pariahs at local establishments where Linda's friends had influence. The psychological warfare extended to my career as well. Linda discovered that one of the board members of my nonprofit organization was the wife of one of Robert's law partners. She began a subtle campaign of undermining my professional reputation, suggesting to this board member that I was unstable and making poor decisions in my personal life that reflected badly on my judgment. She painted herself as a concerned mother worried about my mental health and decision-making capabilities. What made this particularly insidious was how she maintained plausible deniability. When I confronted her about any of these incidents, she would put on her wounded mother act, claiming she was only trying to help me and that I was being paranoid and ungrateful. She'd bring up all the sacrifices she'd made for me, all the money they'd spent on my education, and how heartbroken she was that I was throwing it all away for some environmental nonsense and a boy with no future. The gaslighting was relentless. She would say things like, "Sarah, honey, I'm worried about you. You're not thinking clearly lately. Maybe you should talk to someone professional about these choices you're making." She'd say this in front of family friends, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state while positioning herself as the loving, concerned parent dealing with a troubled adult child. Meanwhile, she was ramping up the pressure for me to come to my senses. She arranged blind dates with sons of her wealthy friends, always making sure to mention how successful and well-connected these men were. When I refused to go on these dates, she'd launch into lectures about how I was wasting my prime years and being selfish by not considering the family's reputation and future. The most manipulative part of her campaign was how she used my father against me. Robert had always been the more supportive parent, but Linda knew exactly how to play on his fears about financial security and social standing. She convinced him that my relationship with Jake and my career in environmental work were signs that I was having some kind of breakdown, and that tough love was needed to snap me out of it. Soon, both my parents were presenting a united front, with Robert reluctantly supporting Linda's increasingly aggressive interventions in my life. Family dinners became interrogation sessions about my future plans. They would tag-team me with arguments about financial responsibility, family expectations, and social propriety. Robert would present the logical arguments about career stability and earning potential, while Linda would follow up with emotional manipulation about disappointment and family reputation. The stress was overwhelming. I was watching my relationship with Jake deteriorate under the constant external pressure. He was losing confidence in himself and in us, wondering if maybe my parents were right about him not being good enough for me. My work performance was suffering because of the hostile environment Linda had created with the board member. I was losing weight, having trouble sleeping, and beginning to question my own judgment about everything. But Linda wasn't satisfied with just making me miserable. She wanted complete capitulation, and she was prepared to escalate until she got it. The birthday party she was planning wasn't just a celebration. It was going to be the stage for her final power play. She was inviting everyone who mattered in our social circle, including several eligible bachelors she wanted me to meet. Her plan was to publicly showcase me as available and reformed, ready to make the right choices and restore honor to the family name. 2 weeks before the party, she sat me down for what she called a heart-to-heart conversation. She laid out her ultimatum with chilling clarity. "Sarah, I've been patient with this phase you're going through, but it's time to grow up. You need to end this ridiculous relationship with that farm boy, quit that dead-end job, and start making choices that reflect well on this family. If you do this, I'll help you apply to law school, and we can put this whole embarrassing chapter behind us. If you don't..." She paused dramatically, letting the threat hang in the air. "Well, then you're choosing them over us, and you'll have to live with the consequences of that choice." I should have seen what was coming next. But nothing could have prepared me for the nuclear bomb she was about to drop on her birthday. The morning of Linda's birthday started like something out of a magazine spread. I'd arrived at the house at dawn to help with the final party preparations, despite every instinct telling me to stay away. The caterers were setting up elegant tables in the backyard, florists were arranging elaborate centerpieces, and Linda was in full hostess mode, directing everything with military precision. I threw myself into helping with the preparations, partly because I still held on to some foolish hope that we could repair our relationship, and partly because I knew that any perceived lack of effort on my part would become ammunition for her later. I spent hours arranging flowers, setting up chairs, and making sure every detail was perfect for her precious guests. As the guests began arriving, I watched Linda transform into her public persona, the warm, gracious hostess who seemed to genuinely care about everyone around her. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting compliments on the beautiful party while subtly steering conversations toward topics that made her look good. Every interaction was calculated to enhance her image as the perfect mother and wife. The party was everything Linda had wanted it to be. The weather was perfect, the food was exquisite, and all the right people were there to witness her social triumph. I played my role as the dutiful daughter, smiling and making small talk with guests while trying to ignore the pointed comments about my career phase and the not-so-subtle introductions to eligible bachelors. But I could see the calculation behind Linda's every move. She was working the room like a politician, dropping hints about my recent confusion and how she was confident I was coming around to making better choices. Several times, I caught her in conversations where she was clearly positioning me as newly available and ready to settle down with the right kind of man. The breaking point came during the gift-opening ceremony. Linda had arranged it as a grand spectacle, with all the guests gathered around to watch her open each beautifully wrapped present. She opened expensive jewelry, luxurious spa packages, and elegant home accessories, thanking each giver with practiced grace while mentally cataloging the social value of each gift. When she got to my gift, a carefully chosen piece of artwork from a local artist that I thought she'd appreciate, her reaction was swift and telling. She barely glanced at it before setting it aside with a polite but dismissive "How unique, Sarah. Thank you." The contrast between her reaction to my heartfelt gift and her effusive thanks for the expensive presents from her wealthy friends was painfully obvious to everyone watching. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Linda stood up to give a speech, thanking everyone for making her birthday so special. She went on about how blessed she felt to be surrounded by such wonderful friends, such a successful husband, and such a beautiful home. Then she paused, looked directly at me, and said words that will be burned into my memory forever. You know, at this stage of my life, I've learned that the greatest gift isn't something you can buy or wrap. The greatest gift is peace of mind, and the knowledge that your family is on the right path. Her eyes never left mine as she continued, sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is be honest about what would truly make them happy. The crowd was hanging on every word, assuming they were about to hear some heartwarming sentiment about family love. Instead, Linda delivered her devastating blow with surgical precision. Sarah, honey, you know what would honestly be the best birthday gift you could give me? If you just disappeared from my life forever. You brought nothing but disappointment and embarrassment to this family, and frankly, my life would be so much more peaceful without your constant drama and poor choices. The silence that followed was deafening. 100 guests stood frozen, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Some gasped audibly, others looked away in embarrassment, and a few pulled out their phones, clearly recognizing that they'd just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. I felt like I'd been physically struck. The woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally had just publicly wished me out of existence, in front of everyone who mattered in our community. She'd used her birthday party, an event I'd helped plan and prepare, as the stage for my public humiliation and rejection. But what hurt the most wasn't just the cruelty of her words. It was the satisfied look on her face afterward, as if she'd finally said what she'd been wanting to say for years. She looked relieved. Like she'd finally unburdened herself of an unwanted responsibility. Robert looked mortified, but he didn't contradict her. He didn't stand up for me or tell her she'd gone too far. He just stood there, paralyzed by social embarrassment, while his wife publicly disowned their only child. The guests began to disperse shortly after, making awkward excuses and avoiding eye contact with me as they left. I could hear the whispered conversation starting already. This would be the gossip sensation of the year. Linda had just given everyone in our social circle front row seats to a family implosion, and they couldn't wait to spread the story. As I stood there in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration, something crystallized in my mind. Linda had just given me the greatest gift she could have possibly given me. She'd shown everyone exactly who she really was, and she'd set me free from any obligation to maintain a relationship with someone who could be so unspeakably cruel. She wanted me to disappear from her life? Fine. I would give her exactly what she asked for. But what she didn't realize was that my disappearance would cost her everything she'd worked so hard to build, and reveal secrets that would destroy the perfect image she valued more than her own daughter. The hours immediately following Linda's public rejection were a blur of shock, humiliation, and surprisingly, clarity. As the last guest awkwardly shuffled away from the wreckage of the birthday party, I made a decision that would change everything. If my mother wanted me to disappear from her life, I would give her exactly what she asked for, but in a way she never could have anticipated. I went home to my apartment that night and began planning the most complete disappearance possible. This wasn't going to be a dramatic storming off or a temporary tantrum. This was going to be a systematic erasure of myself from Linda's world, designed to give her the peace of mind she claimed to want while forcing her to face the consequences of her cruelty. The first step was the most painful. I broke up with Jake. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't bear the thought of him being collateral damage in what I was about to do. I told him that my family situation was more toxic than he knew, and that staying with me would only bring him more pain. He deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire of my war with Linda. Jake fought me on this decision, insisting that we could work through anything together, but I knew that what was coming would test both of us in ways that weren't fair to him. Next, I began the practical aspects of my disappearance. I had some money saved up, and I quietly began converting my assets into cash. I canceled my lease and arranged for my belongings to be put into storage. I applied for jobs in cities far from home, focusing on positions that would allow me to work remotely or travel extensively. Within 2 weeks, I'd secured a position with an international environmental organization that would require me to spend months at a time in remote locations around the world. But here's where my plan got truly comprehensive. I wasn't just disappearing physically. I was erasing every trace of my existence from Linda's social media presence, her photo albums, and her carefully curated family narrative. I began by systematically unfriending and blocking every single person in Linda's social circle on all my social media platforms. Then I changed my name legally, using my grandmother's maiden name, and created entirely new online profiles that couldn't be traced back to the Sarah that Linda knew. The beauty of this approach was that it gave Linda exactly what she'd asked for while forcing her to confront the reality of what it meant to lose a child. She'd spent so much energy being embarrassed by me that she'd never considered how it would look when I was simply gone. I spent my last week in town tying up loose ends and saying goodbye to the few people who mattered to me. My high school English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd always believed in my writing. The librarian who'd helped me research environmental issues for years. The elderly neighbor who'd been kind to me when I was growing up. I told them all that I was leaving for new opportunities, but I also made sure they understood that this wasn't a typical career move, this was a permanent departure. The most crucial part of my plan involved Robert. Despite his failure to defend me at the party, I knew that deep down he did care about me, even if he was too weak to stand up to Linda. I wrote him a letter explaining everything I'd discovered about Linda's manipulative behavior, her systematic destruction of my relationships, and her calculated cruelty. But I didn't just leave it for him to find, I mailed it to his office, ensuring that Linda couldn't intercept it. In the letter, I told Robert about Linda's campaign against Jake, her gossip network designed to sabotage my reputation, and most importantly, I told him about some inconsistencies I'd noticed in Linda's stories about her past. Things that hadn't added up over the years, gaps in her history that she'd always deflected when asked about. I suggested that maybe it was time he looked into some of these mysteries himself. 3 weeks after the birthday party, I was ready to execute my disappearance. I'd arranged for my new job to start immediately, with my first assignment being a 6-month research project in Costa Rica studying sustainable agriculture. Perfect. Remote, difficult to reach, and absolutely aligned with the values Linda had spent years mocking. On a Tuesday morning, I simply vanished. I left my apartment key with the building manager, picked up my single suitcase, and drove to the airport. I'd arranged for a storage company to collect my remaining belongings that afternoon, and I'd left instructions for them to be held indefinitely. I canceled my phone number and email address, activated my new identity, and boarded a plane to San Jose. But before I left, I did one final thing that would set the stage for Linda's eventual downfall. I'd been doing some research into her background, following up on those inconsistencies I'd mentioned to Robert. What I'd discovered was explosive, and I left copies of certain documents in a safety deposit box with instructions for them to be mailed to Robert if anything happened to me. The research had revealed that Linda's carefully constructed persona was built on a foundation of lies. Her stories about her wealthy upbringing, her claims about family connections, even her college degree, none of it checked out. She'd been living a completely fabricated life for over 30 years, and she'd gotten away with it because no one had ever thought to question the elegant, confident woman who seemed so perfectly put together. But the most damaging discovery was about Linda's first marriage, the one she'd never mentioned to anyone. The husband she'd abandoned when she'd created her new identity and moved to our town. The child she'd left behind in the process. You see, this wasn't the first time Linda had wished someone out of her life. And now that I was gone, Robert was going to start asking questions that would unravel everything she'd built. Because the thing about getting exactly what you wish for is that sometimes it comes with consequences you never anticipated. The irony was perfect. Linda had spent so much energy trying to control her image and eliminate anything that embarrassed her, but by driving me away, she'd set in motion the very investigation that would expose all her secrets. And since I'd given her exactly what she asked for by disappearing completely, she wouldn't even be able to reach out to me for help when her world started crumbling down. While I was settling into my new life in Costa Rica, documenting sustainable farming practices in remote villages with limited internet access, Linda was about to discover that getting exactly what you wish for can be your worst nightmare. The first signs of trouble started just 2 weeks after my disappearance, when the local gossip network that had been so eager to witness my public humiliation began asking uncomfortable questions. It started with Margaret, Linda's closest friend and biggest social rival, who called with what she presented as concern but was obviously fishing for information. "Linda, darling, I hope Sarah is doing well. Several people have been asking about her lately, and I realized no one has seen her since your birthday." The pause before your birthday was loaded with meaning. Everyone in their circle was still talking about Linda's shocking public declaration. Linda's initial response was confident and dismissive. "Oh, Sarah is fine. She's finally growing up and focusing on her career. She's been so busy with work that we barely hear from her." But Margaret pressed further, mentioning that Sarah's co-workers at the environmental nonprofit were saying she'd quit without notice, and that Jake had been telling people they'd broken up because Sarah had disappeared without explanation. This was Linda's first hint that my disappearance was more complete than she'd anticipated. In her narcissistic mind, she'd expected me to storm off dramatically, maybe move to another city for a while, but ultimately come crawling back seeking her forgiveness and approval. The possibility that I'd actually taken her birthday wish literally and permanently erased myself from her life hadn't occurred to her. When Linda tried to call me to check in, really to gauge how much trouble my absence was causing her socially, she discovered that my phone number was disconnected. My email address bounced back her messages. My social media accounts were gone. It was as if I'd never existed, and this level of thoroughness was starting to make her panic. But the real trouble began when Robert received my letter at his law office. I'd timed it perfectly. It arrived on a Friday afternoon when Linda was at her weekly spa appointment, giving Robert time to read and process everything I'd written without her interference. The letter was 10 pages long, detailing not just Linda's recent campaign of destruction against my life, but also laying out the inconsistencies in her background that I'd been researching. Robert had always been good at compartmentalizing. It's what made him successful as a lawyer, but this letter forced him to confront patterns he'd been unconsciously ignoring for years. Why had Linda never introduced him to her family? Why were there no photos of her from before they met? Why did her stories about her childhood and college years change slightly each time she told them? And most importantly, why had she been so desperate to control my life and image if she wasn't hiding something significant herself? The letter also contained a bombshell that I'd discovered through careful research. Linda wasn't actually from the wealthy Connecticut family she claimed. Her real name was Lisa Hartwell, and she was from a working-class family in Ohio. More damaging still, she'd been married before, to a man named David Morrison, and they'd had a son together named Tommy. According to the records I'd found, Lisa/Linda had abandoned her first family when Tommy was just 8 years old, leaving behind a trail of debt and broken promises. She'd essentially pulled a disappearing act herself, creating a new identity and backstory before moving to our town and meeting Robert. Everything about her elegant, refined persona was carefully constructed to hide the fact that she was a woman who had already destroyed one family in pursuit of a better life. Robert spent the weekend investigating my claims, using his legal resources to dig deeper into Linda's background. What he found confirmed my research and revealed even more disturbing details. Linda had not only abandoned her first son, but she'd also emptied their joint bank account and maxed out credit cards in David's name before disappearing. David Morrison was still alive, still living in Ohio, and based on the private investigator's report Robert commissioned, still dealing with the financial and emotional damage Linda had caused. Most heartbreaking of all, Tommy Morrison was now 29 years old, and he'd been searching for his mother for over 2 decades. He'd hired investigators, posted on social media, and even appeared on local TV shows asking for information about his missing mother. He had no idea that she was living a completely different life just 3 states away, having replaced him with another child who she'd ultimately rejected as well. When Linda returned from her spa weekend, she found Robert waiting in his study with a stack of documents and an expression she'd never seen before. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Robert laid out everything he'd discovered: her real identity, her abandoned family, her history of financial fraud, and the pattern of behavior that had led to her driving me away just as she'd driven away Tommy all those years ago. Linda's response was pure narcissistic rage. Instead of showing remorse or trying to explain her actions, she attacked Robert for snooping into her past and accused him of being manipulated by my vindictive lies. She insisted that she'd had good reasons for leaving her first family, that David had been controlling and abusive, a claim that Robert's investigation had found no evidence to support, and that Tommy was better off without her. But Robert had seen enough. 27 years of marriage to a woman he was realizing he'd never really known, combined with the loss of his daughter because he'd been too weak to stand up to Linda's manipulation, had finally broken through his tendency to avoid confrontation. He told Linda that he was filing for divorce, and that he was going to help Tommy find his mother whether she cooperated or not. This was when Linda realized that her perfect life was beginning to crumble, and that my disappearance had set off a chain reaction she couldn't control. The daughter she'd been so eager to get rid of was no longer there to serve as a scapegoat for her problems, and without me to blame for the family's dysfunction, people were starting to look more closely at Linda herself. The whispers in their social circle were getting louder. If Linda had been cruel enough to publicly reject her own daughter, what did that say about her character? If Sarah had been so desperate to get away from her mother that she'd completely vanished, what had really been going on behind the closed doors of their seemingly perfect home? And now, with rumors starting to spread about Robert hiring private investigators and filing for divorce, everyone was beginning to suspect that the Morrison family's picture-perfect facade had been hiding something much darker. Linda's carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse, and the woman who'd wished for her daughter to disappear was about to discover that sometimes, when you get exactly what you ask for, it costs you everything else you care about. 6 months into my new life in Costa Rica, I was finally beginning to heal from the trauma of Linda's rejection while building something meaningful with my environmental work. I had limited internet access in the remote research station where I was based, but once a week I would hike to the nearest town to check my secure email account and get updates from the few people back home who knew how to reach me. It was during one of these weekly check-ins that I received an email from Mrs. Rodriguez, my former high school teacher, with a subject line that made my heart race: "You need to know what's happening." Her message was brief but explosive. Robert had filed for divorce, Linda's real identity had been exposed, and apparently she had a son from a previous marriage who was now searching for her. The entire social circle that Linda had worked so hard to impress was buzzing with scandal, and Linda herself had become a social pariah overnight. But Mrs. Rodriguez's email also contained something else: a request from Robert to contact him if I was safe and willing to communicate. He'd given her a secure email address and asked her to pass along a message. He was sorry, he understood why I'd left, and he wanted to make things right if possible. He also wanted me to know that he'd found Tommy Morrison, and that Tommy wanted to meet the sister he'd never known he had. This revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. I had a brother. Not only had Linda abandoned me emotionally, but she'd literally abandoned another child physically, and had spent 30 years keeping us from knowing about each other. The woman who'd criticized my life choices and called me selfish had herself committed the ultimate act of selfishness by abandoning her own son to create a new life for herself. I spent 3 days processing this information before I felt ready to respond to Robert. When I did, I learned the full scope of what had unfolded since my disappearance. Linda's reaction to being exposed had been predictable: denial, rage, and ultimately a desperate attempt to control the narrative. She'd tried to claim that she was the victim, that David Morrison had been abusive, and that she'd been forced to flee for her safety. But Robert's investigation had thoroughly debunked these claims. David Morrison was a gentle man who'd spent decades wondering what he'd done wrong to drive away his wife and traumatize his son. Tommy had grown up believing his mother had died, until he'd accidentally discovered the truth as a teenager and began his long search for her. The financial crimes Linda had committed when she disappeared had ruined David's credit and forced him to work 2 jobs just to keep their home while raising Tommy alone. Robert also told me about Linda's desperate attempts to maintain her social standing as the truth came out. She'd tried to spin the story as a tale of a young woman escaping domestic violence, but too many details didn't add up. The elegant, refined persona she'd cultivated for decades was revealed to be a complete fabrication, and the social circle she'd manipulated for so long turned on her with brutal efficiency. Margaret, her former best friend, had been particularly vicious in spreading the real story. Apparently, Margaret had always resented Linda's social climbing and had been waiting for years for an opportunity to take her down. The revelation that Linda was actually Lisa from Ohio, a woman who'd abandoned her child and stolen money from her husband, was the perfect ammunition. Within weeks, Linda went from being a respected hostess to being completely ostracized from the social scene she'd worked so hard to dominate. But the most devastating blow came when Tommy Morrison arrived in town. Robert had reached out to him immediately after discovering the truth, and Tommy had driven across 3 states to confront the mother who'd abandoned him 21 years earlier. The meeting, which took place in Robert's law office with witnesses present, was as brutal as you might imagine. Tommy was no longer the confused 8-year-old boy Linda had left behind. He was a successful software engineer, married with 2 children of his own, who had spent decades dealing with abandonment issues and trust problems stemming from his mother's betrayal. He'd come not seeking reconciliation, but seeking answers and closure. According to Robert, Linda's response to seeing her first son was telling. Instead of showing remorse or maternal feeling, she was angry that he'd tracked her down and disrupted her life. She accused him of being manipulated by Robert and me, insisted that she'd had no choice but to leave, and actually had the audacity to suggest that he should be grateful because her abandonment had made him stronger. Tommy's response was devastating in its calm precision. He told Linda that he hadn't come to be her son again. That ship had sailed decades ago. He'd come to tell her that he was happily married with children who would never know their grandmother existed, because he refused to expose them to someone capable of such casual cruelty. He also served her with a lawsuit for the financial damages her theft had caused his father, damages that had compounded over 20 years and now totaled over $200,000. The lawsuit was the final nail in the coffin of Linda's social standing. Not only was she revealed as a fraud and a child abandoner, but now she was facing serious financial consequences for her past crimes. The stress of fighting the lawsuit, combined with the divorce proceedings and her complete social exile, was taking a visible toll on her physical and mental health. Robert described a woman who'd aged years in a matter of months. The perfectly put-together hostess was gone, replaced by someone who looked paranoid, desperate, and increasingly unhinged. She'd started drinking heavily, had multiple public confrontations with former friends who no longer acknowledged her existence, and had been caught multiple times driving by Tommy's hotel, apparently trying to work up the courage to approach him again. The most pathetic part was how Linda had started reaching out to anyone who might know how to contact me. She'd called my former workplace, contacted old college friends, and even shown up at Jake's farm demanding to know where I was. But my disappearance had been so complete that no one could help her even if they'd wanted to. Jake, bless him, had told her exactly what he thought of her treatment of me before ordering her off his property. Linda's desperation to find me wasn't driven by maternal love or genuine remorse, it was driven by her need to control the narrative. She'd convinced herself that if she could just get me to come home and play the role of the loving daughter again, she could somehow rebuild her reputation and make this all go away. She didn't understand that the damage was irreversible, and that my absence was forcing everyone to see her clearly for the first time. The financial pressure was mounting as well. Robert's divorce filing had frozen their joint assets pending the proceedings, and Linda's legal fees for fighting both the divorce and Tommy's lawsuit were astronomical. The woman who'd lived 30 years in luxury was suddenly facing the possibility of losing everything she'd worked so hard to acquire. But perhaps the most satisfying part of Robert's update was learning about the social dynamics that had shifted in my absence. Without me there to serve as Linda's scapegoat and target for criticism, people were starting to remember what I'd actually been like. My former teachers spoke up about what a dedicated, compassionate student I'd been. Community members recalled my volunteer work and environmental activism with genuine fondness. Even some of Linda's former friends began to admit that they'd always thought she was too hard on me. Jake, in particular, had become something of a local hero. When people learned the full extent of Linda's campaign against him, and how she'd systematically tried to destroy his reputation and livelihood, the community rallied around him. His organic farm was suddenly busier than ever, with people going out of their way to support someone who'd been treated so unfairly. He'd also started speaking openly about the psychological abuse I'd endured, helping people understand that my disappearance wasn't dramatic teenage rebellion, it was the desperate escape of someone who'd been systematically destroyed by their own mother. The contrast was stark and damning. The daughter Linda had publicly rejected was being remembered with warmth and respect, while Linda herself was being revealed as a manipulative fraud who'd hurt everyone she'd ever claimed to love. The birthday party where she'd wished me out of her life was now being discussed as the moment when she'd finally shown her true colors, and people were horrified that they'd witnessed a mother publicly disowning her child. Reading about all of this from my research station in Costa Rica, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing that the truth was finally coming out, and that Linda was facing consequences for her decades of manipulation and cruelty. But there was also sadness for the family that might have been, and genuine grief for the mother I'd always hoped Linda could become. Most importantly, though, I felt free. Free from the constant criticism, free from the impossible standards, free from the exhausting effort of trying to earn love from someone who was fundamentally incapable of giving it. My disappearance had given me the space to discover who I was without Linda's toxic influence, and I was finally beginning to understand my own worth. 1 year after Linda's devastating birthday wish, I was standing on a beach in Costa Rica, watching the sunrise over the Pacific Ocean, when I received the email that would bring my story full circle. It was from Tommy Morrison, my brother, writing to tell me that Linda had finally gotten exactly what she'd asked for on that fateful birthday, but in ways she never could have anticipated. The email was warm and thoughtful, written by a man who understood abandonment in ways most people never would. Tommy told me that he'd been following my environmental work through the research papers I'd been publishing, and that he was proud to have a sister who was making such a positive impact on the world. But he also had news about Linda that was both shocking and, in a twisted way, perfectly just. Linda had suffered a complete mental breakdown 6 months after my disappearance. The combination of losing her social standing, facing financial ruin from the divorce and lawsuit, and being confronted with the consequences of her lifetime of lies had finally broken her carefully constructed facade. She'd been hospitalized twice for what doctors called acute anxiety and depression, but what Tommy and Robert recognized as the inevitable collapse of someone who'd spent decades living a lie. The most ironic part was what had triggered her final breakdown. She'd become obsessed with finding me, convinced that if she could just get me to come home, she could somehow fix everything that had gone wrong. She'd hired 3 different private investigators, spent thousands of dollars she didn't have, and had even posted desperate messages on social media begging me to contact her. The woman who'd publicly wished I would disappear from her life was now desperately trying to make me reappear. But my disappearance had been too complete. I'd legally changed my name, established a new identity, and was working in remote locations where I was essentially unreachable. Linda's frantic search efforts only served to highlight her desperation and make her look even more unstable to the people who were still watching her downfall unfold. Tommy's lawsuit had been successful. The court had awarded him damages for the financial theft Linda had committed when she abandoned him, plus interest and penalties that had accumulated over 20 years. The judgment was for $347,000, money that Linda simply didn't have. Her divorce settlement with Robert had left her with minimal assets, since the court had taken a dim view of her deception about her identity and background. She was facing bankruptcy, something that would have been unthinkable to the woman who'd once prided herself on her social status and financial security. But the real justice came in the form of social consequences. Linda's former friends hadn't just abandoned her. They'd actively turned against her, spreading the story of her deception and cruelty throughout their social networks. The woman who'd spent decades carefully cultivating relationships based on status and appearance discovered that those relationships were as fake as her own persona. When she needed support the most, she found herself completely alone. Margaret, her former best friend, had been particularly brutal in her rejection. When Linda had called her, desperate for someone to talk to during her breakdown. Margaret had told her exactly what she thought. Linda, or Lisa, or whoever you really are, you made your bed when you decided to destroy your own daughter in public. You showed all of us who you really are, and frankly, Sarah was lucky to escape when she did. The community had rallied around Tommy when he'd decided to stay in town for a few months to handle the legal proceedings. People were fascinated by this kind, successful man who'd overcome such a traumatic childhood abandonment, and they were appalled to learn the full extent of what Linda had done to her first family. Tommy had handled the attention with grace, often redirecting conversations to talk about his father David, who'd raised him alone with such dedication and love. Even more satisfying was how people's perception of me had completely shifted. Without Linda there to constantly criticize and undermine me, people began to remember and share stories about my kindness, my intelligence, and my genuine passion for environmental causes. Jake had become something of a spokesperson for my character, telling anyone who would listen about the psychological abuse I'd endured and how strong I'd been to finally break free from it. The environmental nonprofit where I'd worked had created a scholarship in my name for young women pursuing careers in sustainability. My high school had asked to include my story in their guidance counseling program as an example of overcoming family dysfunction to pursue your passion. Even Linda's former social circle had begun to speak positively about me, as if they were trying to distance themselves from their previous complicity in Linda's treatment of me. But Tommy's email contained one more piece of information that completed the circle of justice. Linda had finally achieved the isolation she'd always feared. Living alone in a small apartment, estranged from both her children, divorced from her husband, abandoned by her friends, and facing financial ruin, she'd gotten exactly what she'd wished for on her birthday: a life without me in it. The only problem was that without me to blame for all her problems, she'd been forced to confront the fact that she was the common denominator in all her failed relationships. Tommy ended his email with an invitation that brought tears to my eyes. He and his wife wanted me to visit them in Ohio when I returned to the States. They wanted their children to meet their Aunt Sarah, and they wanted to build the sibling relationship that Linda's lies had stolen from us for so many years. David, Tommy's father, also wanted to meet me. He'd apparently told Tommy that he was proud to know that Tommy had a sister who was making such a positive difference in the world. As I sat on that beach, reading my brother's words and watching the sun rise over the ocean, I felt a profound sense of completion. Linda had wished for me to disappear from her life, and I'd given her exactly what she asked for. But in doing so, I'd discovered my own strength, found my biological family, and built a career that gave my life meaning and purpose. The woman who'd spent my entire childhood telling me I was a disappointment was now the one whose life had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of valuing image over substance, control over love, and perfection over authenticity. She'd gotten her wish: I was gone from her life, but she'd lost everything else in the process. The sweetest part of this justice wasn't that Linda was suffering, though there was admittedly some satisfaction in knowing that her cruelty had finally caught up with her. The sweetest part was that I was thriving. I was doing work I loved, building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, and living authentically in a way that Linda had never allowed me to do while I was under her control. Sometimes the best revenge isn't plotting someone's downfall, it's succeeding so completely without them that their absence from your life becomes a gift rather than a loss. Linda had tried to destroy my confidence, my relationships, and my dreams, but in the end, she'd only destroyed herself. And you know what? I think that's exactly the kind of karma the universe serves up when someone is cruel enough to wish their own child out of existence. She got her birthday wish, all right. She just never anticipated how empty her life would feel once it came true. So here's my question for all of you who've stuck with this wild family saga: have you ever had someone in your life who treated you so badly that their absence became a blessing? Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally are the ones who hold us back the most, and it takes incredible courage to walk away from toxic family dynamics, especially when it means losing everything familiar. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama stories. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes going no contact with toxic family members isn't giving up, it's choosing yourself. And drop a comment telling me about your own experiences with family karma or justice served moments. I read every single comment, and your stories inspire me more than you know. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember, sometimes the best gift you can give someone who wishes you'd disappear is to grant their wish and build an amazing life without them. Trust me, the view from the other side of freedom is absolutely beautiful.